Sunjeev Bery is the Middle East Advocacy Director for Amnesty International USA. He now joins us via Skype from Washington. Thank you very much for joining us, Sunjeev. Now, the report that Syrian authorities have killed as many as 13,000 people, or possibly more. How did Amnesty International come to this conclusion?
Amnesty International, over the last year to 2 years, has been conducting research with witnesses to the atrocities and crimes against humanity committed at Syria prison, including both survivors as well as those who were former guards at the prison.
Now, Sunjeev, let's look at the part where Amnesty International says they believe that these atrocities are still taking place. Where has that been established?
Well, there's no reason to believe that they've stopped. You know, the Syrian government continues to deny that any of these atrocities ever happened, which shows that there's a complete environment of impunity within the Syrian government and the Syrian armed forces with regards to the mass torture, the industrial-scale torture, as well as the mass hangings. So there's no reason to believe that any of this has stopped, and we've clearly documented a regular pattern in which as many as 50 people a week at Syria prison since 2011 on have been taken out of their cells for regular mass hangings.
Now, this took place at a prison. Is there any way to know if this happened in correlation with the crimes that were committed, or was it just random acts?
Well, the so-called trials were 1 to 3 minutes long. So over the course of 60 to 180 seconds, basically a rubber stamp is applied and a death registry is signed for the prisoner. You know, it's safe to assume that the thousands of people who have been killed by the Syrian government in Syria prison and in other prisons are innocent of any crimes. And if there was any guilt to be ascertained, certainly there are no trials that are happening that are legitimate trials or fair trials. And on top of that, executions and the death penalty would never be the answer.
Now, we know that Amnesty International wants the UN Human Rights Council to investigate violations occurring there. Your previous report said 17,000 people had died in prisons across the country. What would Amnesty International like to see happen to those behind the reported atrocities?
Well, those who are in charge of these prisons need to be held accountable. The prisons themselves need to be opened up immediately, and international human rights observers need to be there on the ground in the communities and inside the prisons. In addition to that, those who are committing these atrocities need to be held accountable. For far too long, Russia and China have blocked the UN Security Council from taking appropriate action, which would include referring this matter of Syria to the International Criminal Court. These are crimes against humanity. This is industrial-level killing and torture that the Syrian government is conducting that has to be happening with the knowledge of the highest levels of the Syrian government, up to and including President Bashar al-Assad.
Now, speaking of being on the ground and the atrocities that are taking place, I mean, over the past couple of months, we've seen the real situation in Syria. We've seen images of children splashed all over the media, and what's really happening there. What is the UN doing in terms of being on the ground and ensuring that children and women are being protected in Syria?
Well, women and children, unfortunately, are not being protected in Syria. You know, civilians have been slaughtered. There have been as many as 400,000 killed. Half the country have fled their homes, and we have a global refugee crisis as a consequence. One of the most important things that people can do right now is to push their governments to accept Syrian refugees who are fleeing horror stories exactly like the horror stories in Syria prison. You know, you have people all across Syria who, if they aren't fleeing the crimes against humanity by Bashar al-Assad's government, are fleeing the war crimes of ISIS or other armed groups that have totally failed to differentiate between combatants and civilians. So it's incumbent on the world community to push for access into Syria, to provide aid and to document what's happening. It's also incumbent on the global community to accept refugees from Syria for resettlement so that people who are escaping these horror stories have somewhere else they can go.
Sunjeev, I'm actually glad you mentioned the global refugee crisis. I mean, when do we go beyond talk shops? We've seen the EU meeting to speak about the migration crisis, for example, and you've just mentioned that it's up to countries to take these refugees in. But when can we see real action being taken?
Well, this is a big problem. You know, the EU and European governments have engaged in a disgraceful agreement with the government of Turkey, in essence paying off the government of Turkey so that in return Turkey would not allow Syrian refugees or other refugees to come into Europe. At the same time, here in the United States, President Donald Trump has put a ban on Muslims from 7 countries coming into the United States, in addition to a ban on Syrian refugees, at the very moment where you have horror stories like those documented by Amnesty International with regards to Sednaya prison. So this is a catastrophic problem in which Western governments and other governments are conspiring through silence to do very little to help those refugees who are trying to escape the prisons and the killing fields in Syria.
Sunjeev, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us on SABC News. That was Sunjeev Bery, and he's the Advocacy Director for Middle East and North Africa, and he was joining us via Skype from Washington.